On March the 2nd, 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder began. A sustained strategic bombing campaign against North Vietnam, which continued until October 1968. A campaign that led to a vast amount of destruction, but no strategic victory for the U.S. By 1967, the United States had dropped more bombs on Vietnam than the Allies had dropped in Europe in the Second World War. The airstrikes aimed to convince leaders in Hanoi to come to the negotiating table. But they were largely ineffective.
When you look, 4 million tons of American bombs dropped on South Vietnam. I think one could reasonably guess that about 3.99 million tons achieved absolutely nothing except to devastate the environment and kill a lot of civilians.
The military situation worsened in Vietnam. In July 1965, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, recommended escalation. He later reflected that this was the beginning of a tragic and slippery slope. The decision was informed in part by hubris, the unwavering self-belief that the United States was the superior force, the flawed belief that they could not be beaten. Many in the United States did not realize Vietnam would be a very different kind of war.
The Americans were still on a sort of World War II and Korean War battlefield where they would have massive military attacks preceded by bombardments and aerial support. This sort of war would not function at all in the jungles of Vietnam.
American General Westmoreland believed in the strategy of attrition. If he deployed enough firepower and enough of his opponent's forces were killed, the battle would be won.
The Viet Cong were very effective guerrilla fighters. It's very interesting to listen to Americans who were in Vietnam in 1964, 1965 talk about this, because they went over there very optimistically. They believed that they would prevail against this ragtag army of Vietnamese. They should have read their history books. They should have read what happened to the French.
The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese fighters had learned to combat the industrial machines of war using classic guerrilla tactics. They would hit and run and attack only when they were sure of victory.
They developed what might be called a grab and hold tactic, where rather than staying at a far distance when the helicopter comes in, as it's landing, it's very vulnerable. They want to hit that helicopter with small arms fire and try to destroy it. And then once the American soldiers disembark, then they want to attack on foot as quickly as possible, so that if those Americans call in an airstrike, they're going to kill their own people.
U.S. strategists also adapted their tactics. In 1966, the U.S. adopted a search and destroy strategy. Men were sent out on patrol from fire bases to locate and engage the enemy. Once engaged, artillery and aircraft could be called in to suppress the enemy. The strategy, Westmoreland hoped, would find, fix, and finish the elusive Viet Cong. But the guerrillas were fighting on home ground, which gave them a distinct advantage.
The guerrilla warfare they did was very, very effective. The Viet Cong had been fighting for generations. They knew the jungles, they knew how to hide, they knew how to bury themselves in the ground, they knew how to build the tunnels, which they would melt into.
Pitted against these effective guerrilla fighters were many inexperienced Allied soldiers, fighting a war on foreign soil with little training for the environment which confronted them.
I mean, for example, a lot of firefights. You'd have a Marine or US Army unit that was advancing through the jungle on a sweep, which could go on for days or weeks. And they'd trudge through this dreadful country day after day. And nothing happens for days and weeks, and then suddenly, wham! And they find themselves in a firefight where very often the Viet Cong would just fire for 30 seconds, a minute, and then be away before the Americans could deploy air power or artillery power against them.
Direct contact was not the only threat while on patrol. The Viet Cong also turned their enemies' weapons against them.
On any given day, there would be thousands of leftover American artillery shells or bombs or duds. The Viet Cong would go in and take those duds or those unexploded bombs away and then turn them into their own improvised mines. It was like playing Russian roulette, marching through the jungle.
Other traps drew on materials within the jungle itself.
The punji stakes in the pits that were camouflaged by very thin coverings is a prime example. They might put spikes into big logs and hang them on trees with a tripwire so the log would fly down right about chest height and impale Marines that were doing patrols. So they were very, very effective, and they maximized whatever environmental factors they could, whether it's in the jungle or the rice paddies or even in the streets to someplace like Saigon.
One United States policy which worked against the ability to recognize and counter these threats was the system of rotation.
For instance, rotating people out of the jungle after about 7 or 8 months and out of the country after a year, it meant that whether it was officers or men, almost as soon as anybody gained experience in how to do this stuff, they were sent home again. So you had these guys up against Viet Cong, some of whom had been fighting for 20 years. And not too surprisingly, the Viet Cong and later the North Vietnamese were better jungle soldiers.
For the American troops and their allies patrolling the jungle, the guerrilla tactics and lack of clear battle lines posed a significant psychological threat. An attack might come from anywhere and anyone.
You didn't know who the enemy was because they weren't in uniform. They wore the same sort of black pajama type outfits as the ordinary peasant in the fields. The peasant in the field could have a gun buried under a bush, and as soon as the soldiers passed, thinking that they were friendly, they'd whip out the gun and shoot them.
Among the most ingenious elements of the Viet Cong's guerrilla campaign was the use of the tunnel system. The use of tunnels in war was not new. Soldiers of many different generations, in many different kinds of war, have dug into the earth in search of protection. But the sophistication and extent of the tunnels made them a remarkable part of the Vietnam Jungle War story. They included medical facilities, kitchens, storage areas for food and ammunition, sleeping quarters, as well as ventilation shafts and smoke outlets.
The Viet Cong were slight, small people. The American big fellas couldn't chase them down there. They could disappear, and then the Americans would march over them and they'd reappear behind them. This happened many, many times, and I don't think the Allies really adapted to that well.
Vietnamese women were active participants in the war. As members of the National Liberation Front, women undertook a range of roles, from carrying supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to making punji sticks. And some carried weapons themselves. Guerrilla fighters who became known as the long-haired warriors.
Culturally, the Americans, we're Western, and we have, divisions of labor and spheres between the genders that are well established. And I think the lens through which the Americans looked at the Vietnamese made them want to zero in on adult men who could be warriors, could be fighters, could be members of the Viet Cong. And they tended to ignore the effectiveness of women.
In the North and South, women gave sustenance, medical assistance, shelter, and support to guerrilla fighters.
Some 2 million women served in some capacity with the North Vietnamese Army and with the Viet Cong, whether it's as spies, as saboteurs, as recruiters, even as combatants in the Viet Cong.
And so the war in the jungle continued. Each side absorbing blows from the other, adapting tactics, incurring increasing casualties. The Americans and their allies may have seen themselves as the guardians at the gate, holding up the dominoes in Southeast Asia. But as the years stretched on, victory became ever more elusive. The Tet Offensive, a series of attacks by Viet Cong and NVA forces launched in January 1968, proved that even a strategic victory would not necessarily win the day for the U.S. and her allies.